My name is Morris Walton. I'm the president of the Bridge Street History Center. We thank you for coming. We welcome you to this 2022 Ramey McAtee Speaker Series. And just something I want to clear up right to begin with, cataracts. So if you're wondering, then you can quit wondering about it and just listen. What I would like to do now is just to recognize our sponsors. And I know that you've got a list there, but these people really have made this possible, so I really want to just identify them. Berry Wealth Management, Mike and Sharon Gilbert, Granbury Live, David and Kathy Cuban, John Henry Maryland Luton, Dr. Alex Smith, David and Claudia Southern, Stonewall Title Company, and Wellington State Bank. And I would also say that Mike Igo of Barron Creek Vineyards has really been a help to us also. And so we thank all of those people. You know, it's one of those things that when you, in whatever involvement you have in this community, you know that there are things that you really think are really good ideas, and there's no shortage of good ideas. But one thing that you discover is the real limitation is usually execution. And that has to do with financing. And so if we wouldn't be able to do what we've done tonight without the financial support that we receive from our sponsors. If you've been to our events before, then you've heard me or you've heard some other member of the board give you what our mission statement is. It's to collect, preserve, and interpret the life stories of the people of Granbury and Hood County. And that's it. That's what we do. And that's what we do at our museum at 319 East Bridge, is we tell the stories about the people of Hood County. We're a storytelling museum. I don't consider our board, we don't consider ourselves to be object museums. It's not that we don't have objects in our museum, but those objects are there to tell part of the story. And that's what we really see is our responsibility in doing these things. Several years ago, we decided, the board decided, that for one evening a year, we would redirect our mission. And what we decided to do was to invite speakers into our community. And so we would have an opportunity to have people to address history issues, but on a broader scale than just on Granbury and Hood County. We began this program in 2015. Our first speaker was Dr. Stephen Woodworth. And Dr. Woodworth is with us tonight. He really helped us get this whole concept kicked off. He's been a very good friend of the Bridge Street History Center, and he's here tonight. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but in 2016, our guest was S.C. Gwynne. Mr. Gwynne came and he spoke with us about his book, Empire of the Summer Moon, Quanah Parker, and the Rise and Fall of Comanche, the most powerful tribe in American history. As you probably will remember, that book spent 82 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. That's pretty impressive. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Mr. Green can correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the little YouTube things that I was watching was an interview with him, and over 1 million copies of that book has been sold worldwide. Am I correct? Okay. Okay, I stand corrected. That is 2.5 million. I wanted to say somewhere over 1 million. That's somewhere over 1 million. It's just a lot over 1 million. Yeah, and last year you will recall, and there's a method to this madness that I'm doing it. You will recall that we had Steve Harrigan here. And he spoke to us on Big Wonderful Thing. You remember Judge Ken Wise called it a sweeping 5-pound history of Texas. It really does. It weighs 5 pounds. And it was great. At the end of his presentation and at the book signing, he told us, he said, look, if I can ever help y'all by making a recommendation about a speaker, let me know. We followed up on that and asked him to recommend a speaker. Number one on his list was S.C. Gwynne. And then we just thought, well, that is so perfect. When I was starting to prepare and just kind of get my mind around this, one of the things I like to do is look on YouTube and see interviews or see talks about our speakers. So I did that. My favorite talk, or the favorite thing that I found on Mr. Gwynne, was a joint interview between Mr. Gwynne and Mr. Harrington at LBJ Library. Mr. Gwynne talked about his book, Hymns of the Republic. It was October the 16th of 2019, I think is when that was. And Mr. Harrington talked about his book. And as I watched that, I thought, wow. Now, we didn't have the privilege of having them both at one time in one interview, but we have had the privilege of having them in back-to-back. And so it's really a great honor and opportunity for us to have the speakers and the qualifications that they have in these last 2 years have really been good. I think you're really going to enjoy Mr. Gwynne tonight. Okay. Now, the really hard part is introducing him. And what I mean by that, if you go and you start looking about qualifications, I couldn't do it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes. I mean the Cliff Notes. If you really want to see the qualifications Mr. Gwynne you need to go check it out for yourself. But I'll give you these. He was raised in New Canaan, Connecticut. He graduated from Princeton with a degree in history in 1974. He had a master's degree, or took a master's degree in writing from Johns Hopkins University. He and his wife, Katie, live in Austin. His books include, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but his books include, in addition to Empire of the Summer Moon, and in addition to Hymns of the Republic, Stonewall Jackson, The Violence and Passion and Redemption of Stonewall Jackson, which was also a New York Times bestseller and was named a finalist of both the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Penn Literary Award for biography. In 2016, he released American Genius and the Reinvention of Football, which won several top 10 sports lists. His most recent, we didn't talk any about this, his most recent book, which I think will be released in 2023, is The Life and Tragic Death of the World's Largest Flying Machine, His Majesty's Airship, The Life and Tragic Death of the World's Largest Flying Machine. That's coming out next year. Now, tonight, we're going to hear about this book. We're going to hear about Hymns of the Republic. Now, before I have Mr. Gwynne come out, you need to know, in addition to his books, he wrote extensively, has written extensively for Texas Monthly, where he was executive editor for 2000 and 2008. Prior to joining Texas Monthly, Mr. Gwynne worked for Time Magazine as a correspondent, bureau chief, national correspondent, and senior editor, to name a few. Now, what we're going to do is Mr. Gwynne is going to come, he's going to speak. We'll have a question and answer at the end of that. So if you have something that you hear or there's something that you want to ask, you'll have an opportunity to do that. After that, we're going to have a book signing. And I was explaining, this is kind of a new operation for us to have our book signing in one location like that. So you're kind of the guinea pigs. We think it'll work really smooth. You got a number when you came in, and my friend Tom Hamilton is going to call the numbers, so we don't have a really bad lineup at the book signing table. So you will be in a group. Your number will be called. In the meantime, we'll have wine and cheese out on the patio out there in here, and you'll have an opportunity to buy your book and get it signed. The books we're selling, we're going to sell two: Hymns of the Republic and Empire of the Summer Moon. So, one final thing. If you're not a friend of the Bridge Street History Center, you're going to have an opportunity to join our organization tonight if you think that the things that we try to do here are worth your support. So, Mr. Gwynne, would you come and talk to us about hymns of the Republic?
Well, some of you may notice have noticed the words Civil War are appearing in social and news media these days with rather alarming frequency. It's astounding that that would be true, something that wasn't true at the time that I first started writing about the American Civil War. The idea is, well, we might have one, or we're about to have one, or we're in one right now. And depending on who's talking, this is either a bad thing or a good thing. It's either the unfortunate side effect of democracy or the actual core strength of democracy itself. And then there's the question of how we would define a civil war these days. Is it a riot in the Capitol, January 6th? Is it street fighting in Portland? What is it? It's an interesting question. Although any states that wanted to secede, I would recommend very strongly that now they stock up on things like Hellfire missiles and 200 millimeter satellite guided howitzers and nuclear submarines, because there's a big imbalance that I've noticed these days between federal power and state power compared to 150 years ago. Which brings me to the actual Civil War. My book, Hymns of the Republic, is about the final year of the American Civil War. A few years ago, actually back in 2014, I published a biography of Stonewall Jackson called Rebel Yell. And it was it covered roughly the first years of the war until Jackson's death at Chancellorsville in May 1863. The war began in 61, till his death in May of 1863. And the early battles that I wrote about, including First and Second Bull Run, Antietam, 7 Days, were to the people of the time shockingly violent affairs. All the more so because nobody north or south, had any idea that the war was going to be like that. Everybody thought the fighting would be very glorious and over very quickly, and ending, of course, with a victory for their side. It's amazing to think about how deeply people believe that. It was going to be quick and glorious. And then boys marched off to war with light in their eyes and glory in their hearts, and even when they died horribly of wounds or sickness, the idea of glory in those days, the early days of the war, persisted. There was still a certain innocence in those first 2 years of the war that was absolutely missing in the final year of the war. Hope and optimism somehow still trumped hatred and despondency. But as I was reading in the final year of the war, this is after I'd published the Stonewall Jackson book, I was reading about the final year of the war. I was struck by just how hard and cruel and bitter and vengeful the war had become by comparison. And just as important, how hard and cruel and bitter and vengeful its participants had become. When you write about a subject as vast as the Civil War, you're always looking to narrow your point of focus. You're some way to reduce the size of your aperture, some way to sort of give an organizing principle to the war. And writing a biography of Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson is one way to do that. The aperture shrinks to fit the person. You're looking at the world through their eyes. So it seemed to me that because I reacted so strongly to reading about the last year of the war, I said, this is just such a different war than the war I had spent 4 years writing about, Stonewall Jackson. It's such a different war. So I said, well, okay, the time period itself could be that aperture. That's my aperture. The aperture is the year of the war. And everything that goes in it, which is very different than the other book. So I thought, boy, that's a pretty good idea for a book. And I thought, well, it's probably been done a lot. And so I did what highly trained historians do. I Googled it. And Google's this complex algorithm, and I'll tell you about it later. But anyhow, and I was expecting really there to be a bunch of books about the wars last year, but there weren't. There was the last one happened to be my favorite all-time Civil War book, Stillness at Appomattox by Bruce Catton, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1954. And that was it. So I thought, okay, I got a clear field to run on, and I know it's a good subject because, you know, Bruce Catton wrote about it. So my story begins, again, roughly a year before the war ends, a year before Appomattox. It's an otherwise, so this is, my book begins on March 8th, 1864, an otherwise inconspicuous day, except for on that day, for the fact that on that day, Ulysses S. Grant, the most celebrated general in the Union Army, the glorious victor of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, arrived in Washington, D.C. on a train with his 13-year-old son, Fred. He was there to receive a commission. He had traveled to Washington to receive a commission from Abraham Lincoln as a lieutenant general. That particular promotion had only been given twice in American history, once to George Washington and once to Winfield Scott, the hero of the War of the Mexican-American War. And because these were largely honorary, non-wartime promotions, Ulysses S. Grant became the first full-blown three-star general in American history. Grant's problem that day was that because of a logistical error, no one had shown up at the train station to meet him, which meant that this man, who was as famous as Abraham Lincoln, as substantially more popular, stood in the middle of Union Station in his linen duster and army hat, looking blankly around for somebody who might know him or welcome him. He finally gave up. He took a horse-drawn cab over to the War Department to find his boss, who was Army General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. But Halleck wasn't there at his office, so then he got in another horse-drawn cab and took it over to Halleck's house, and Halleck wasn't there either. So having traipsed across town and failed 3 times to find anyone who might welcome him, Grant decided he would just go on to the Willard Hotel, which is still there in Washington. It was called Willard's in those days, where he had been told that he had a reservation at Willard's. But even in the lobby of the Willard, Washington's busiest hotel, a few blocks from the White House, no one recognized the great general. This is sort of a lesson in, I guess, in celebrity and the different types of celebrity compared to now. He wasn't recognized partly because he was in fact a rumpled little guy in a dusty coat with a mousy beard and slightly stooped shoulders who didn't look like much of anything at all, and partly because he'd spent virtually his entire career in the Midwest and West. He had gone to West Point, but then he cleared out after that and really didn't come back. So nobody really knew what he looked like. This is astonishing to look back on. This is in spite of the fact that oceans of printer's ink had been spent on this guy. I mean, he'd been the subject of every newspaper in the country for a long time. This was in spite of the fact that a full-length portrait, 2 blocks away, a full-length portrait of him hung in a congressional meeting room, you know, a full-length portrait with his hand on a ruined Confederate cannon. It would be, and for him not to be recognized would be the equivalent these days of, let's say, Barack Obama and Lady Gaga walking in to the Willard lobby and not being recognized. I use those two because of the level of fame. I mean, Grant was one of the most famous people in the world. Nobody recognized him. He goes up to the desk, he registers, he goes up to the room, still unrecognized. He and Fred now come down for dinner. Now, he's sitting there and eating dinner with Fred, and finally somebody figures it out. And somebody in the Willard dining room stands up and starts banging on a glass. And, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to tell you that with us tonight is the great hero of the Union, Ulysses S. Grant. The place went completely berserk. I mean, just wild. But nowhere near as wild as the White House went an hour later when he went to Lincoln's reception at the White House, where there were stampedes going on, where William Seward had to grab Grant and drag him up onto a sofa to avoid getting crushed. I mean, ladies' dresses were torn, buttons were flying everywhere. So there's this man. So this is rock star treatment. And why? So why such treatment? Well, because Grant was not only there to accept this commission from Lincoln, and as glorious as it was, he was there to save the Union. And people thought of it exactly that way. He was there to win the war and to do it quickly. He had come east to fight Robert E. Lee in what people thought of then as single combat almost. It was the great genius of the South against the great genius of the war of the North. And they were going to finally face each other across a Virginia field in this magnificent sort of final combat. And everybody thought it was going to be a finish fight, and both sides thought they would win. We're in March of 1864. They were all wrong. Nobody was going to win anything, not yet anyway. But in not winning, the two generals would unleash in just a few months a storm of blood and death that beggared even what had happened in the killing fields of Gettysburg and Chancellorsville. One of the big questions about the war's final year, the subject of my book, is why did it have to happen at all? How could such an outmanned, outgunned, and virtually bankrupt Confederacy continue to fight? Why couldn't the Union, with its phenomenal edge in resources and manpower, simply win? The reasons for that are a bit complicated, but the overriding reason was a grizzled 57-year-old general named Robert E. Lee, whose specialty was winning battles in which he was outnumbered 2-1, making fools of Union generals, and tying the Washington war bureaucracy in knots, particularly the latter. Whatever you think about Lee, he was so good on the battlefield that his opponents not only had to contend with the physical fact of his armies, they also had to contend with the idea of Lee, the legendary, indomitable, not quite real genius. And the idea often frightened people more than the armies did. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, for example, where Lee was outnumbered 2-1, Union General Joe Hooker had fled, ultimately, from the idea. When General John Pope's large Union army had beaten a hasty retreat into Washington after the Second Battle of Bull Run, the reason was not because it was outnumbered or outgunned. It was afraid of an idea, of a legend. In the beginning of this last year of the war, Grant put in motion more than 170,000 Union troops in Virginia in what amounted to a grand encirclement of Lee's armies. So there were going to be other troops deployed in that spring, but 170,000 just in Virginia, just focus on this one man and his army. Destroy Lee in place. That did not happen. Quite the reverse. Lee's forces sent 3 Union armies reeling and fought Grant's Army of the Potomac to a bloody standstill at the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania, and Petersburg, a campaign where 85,000 men were killed and wounded. And this was far more blood and death in a shorter time than anyone had ever witnessed in the Civil War. This was what really happened in the finished fight between Grant and Lee. Lee wasn't exactly winning the war. You couldn't have said that. The Union Army wasn't being driven from the field, but he wasn't losing either. But Lee's success came at an enormous price, and it came in the form of something I call the Lee paradox. The problem with a South that would not lose, commanded by a tactical genius who could not be beaten, was that the more this went on, and this became breathtakingly apparent in the war's final year, the faster the world of the American South was destroyed. The more Lee won, the more everything else was lost. The Confederacy, in fact, was taking everyone and everything down with it, starting in the places that had seen the most fighting, but extending deep into other places where armies had never been and had never fought. Union armies by this point already occupied large sections of Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas, along with nearly every major coastal port in the entire Mississippi River. The economic destruction of the South was immense. 2/3 of all Southern wealth had vanished. I mean, think of that, 2/3 of the wealth of a nation. Half of its livestock, half of its farm machinery. It was gone, an agrarian nation with half of its farm machinery gone. 30% of all white men gone between the ages of 20 and 40. Much of the wealth that had disappeared had nothing to do with stocks or bonds or cash or real estate. It existed in the form of escaped slaves, who, as the war lengthened, had been flooding by the hundreds of thousands across Union lines, never to return. The value of the Confederate dollar was quickly dropping towards zero, where it would soon arrive. In the spring of 1865, the rebel government paid 1,000 Confederate dollars for a single pair of shoes. The individual rebel soldier lived in a world that was beyond atrocious. At Petersburg and Richmond, they were in rat holes, subsisting on little more than a few handfuls of vermin-filled cornmeal and rancid fat. Regiments of 300 men often had only 50 pairs of shoes. Worst of all for the soldiers, ironically, worst of all those hardships were the letters from home telling of the impossible lives that their families were leading and the economic hardship at home. There were refugees everywhere across the South. People forget about the hundreds of thousands of them just homeless, roaming through the South. None of this particular brand of bitterness and misery that I'm talking about with all these numbers here existed in the early years of the war. This was the Lee paradox. Perhaps most bitter of all for many Southerners was the advent of large numbers of black soldiers in the Union Army, an astounding 180,000 by the war's end, or 10% of the total Union Army, enough to make a critical difference in the outcome of the war. More than 60% of the 180,000 were former slaves. This is all happening in the final year. The presence of black soldiers in the Union Army had another really disastrous effect on both sides. In the early war, there had been a parole exchange system, which meant that most prisoners of war were exchanged pretty quickly, because it was just equal, whatever. There was no perceived benefit to keeping them, so they exchanged them. But this system broke down when the Confederacy refused to treat black and white soldiers equally. It led to the creation of, which then in turn led to these creation of prison camps, of which, Andersonville would be the one that would immediately come to mind, one which where it had a 28% death rate or something, an incredibly grim prisoner of war camp, but actually Elmira in New York was every bit as bad, so just a 1% difference in the death rate, so the North was not spared, or the South wasn't spared that in prisoner treatment. And in these camps in the final year, more than 30,000 on each side died in captivity. These are people who died while they were prisoners. As one historian wrote, the suffering of the prisoners did more to inhibit post-war reconciliation than any other episode of the war. Talk about bitterness. On top of all this, the final year saw the rise of guerrilla war on a scale unprecedented. This was not only kind of semi-official Confederate raiders like John Singleton Mosby raiding in kind of that sort of a guerrilla war, but also citizen militias, citizen against citizen, particularly in the border states. So, the Lee paradox. The Lee paradox affected Lee himself on a personal level too. He lost his 3 large and once prosperous estates. If you've ever been to Arlington Cemetery and seen that big house there that looks like the Federal Reserve Bank, that was his personal house, a Greek-inspired mansion. He lost all of his land and slaves, and by war's end, virtually all of his wealth. He believed he knew exactly why, too. Lee, a deeply religious man, interpreted his lack of success on the battlefield to his own and his nation's estrangement from God. In his mind, God, not man, was the arbiter of war. God decided who won and lost. Thus, losses in battle, let's say Vicksburg, Gettysburg, or Chattanooga in the War of Attrition in the summer of 1864, were a result of a fall from grace. It is plain, Lee once said, that we have not suffered enough, labored enough, repented enough to deserve success. Our people have thought too much of themselves and their ease. His soldiers took credit for themselves for their victories when they shouldn't have. If you look at photographs of Lee of that era too, he looks like a different man. He's sick. He's got a heart disease, which he didn't really know about at that point. He was overweight. He was not the same man who had once been considered by men and women to be the best looking man in the army. Anyway, the hope at this point, the hope for the South, spring coming into summer 1864, was not that it could win the war, it was no longer that it could win the war. I mean, nobody really believed that anymore. Nobody believed that the South could win militarily. There was no way that was ever going to happen. But by not losing or by winning enough smaller contests, and by creating an idea in the North that the human and financial cost of the war, of this interminable war, were too great, they might remove Abraham Lincoln from power. Now, in a war where it's very difficult to get clarity, the Civil War is so complex. It's hard to get moments of clarity where you feel like you understand something and really understand it, because there's always 22 other things that you didn't take into account. But one of the things that's extremely clear, and it was clear to everybody that spring, was that the war was about one man, Abraham Lincoln, and it was about the election of 1864. The Democrat who beat Lincoln would have enormous pressure on him to make peace, whether with the Union restored and the Confederacy tucked back inside, or with two separate countries. This Lee could still do. Lee could make enough trouble that Lincoln lost the election. Lincoln, by the way, was being attacked from all fronts in his own party, but also particularly by the Democrats, who wanted peace at all costs. And there was this great campaign through the summer to achieve that. So Lee knew, or Lee believed, that all he had to do was keep that war going long enough, inflict just enough casualties. He couldn't win, but he could end the war. It was always interesting to me that when they interviewed after the Vietnam War, when they interviewed the generals in North Vietnam, that this was their model: don't lose, keep the political problems boiling back home, and eventually you're going to win. I think he's probably right. Maybe the worst of all. Okay, but there's one more effect of the Lee paradox. We've seen all these other, the more you win, the more you lose. But maybe the worst of all of the consequences of the paradox was a shift to a type of warfare that it would have been absolutely unimaginable when the war began. The main driver of this change was a brilliant and flawed Union general named William Tecumseh Sherman. He became the chief architect and theorist of a hard and uncompromising war, not against armies, but against civilians. Something absolutely unthinkable in the first 2 years of the war. To understand the harsh new war, you need to understand Sherman himself. He was a character like no other. He's just so entertaining. Manic might be the best way to describe him. He was a man in constant motion. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't stop fidgeting. He couldn't stop moving, and he never stopped talking. You couldn't shut him up. He occasioned millions of words in the press, and he generated millions of his own. He was a word machine. And he was, from a public standpoint, probably the most publicized figure of the 19th century, and that includes Abraham Lincoln. Like Grant, Sherman had a disappointing military career and then had failed repeatedly in business, hitting bottom just before the start of the war. Grant had redeemed himself early in the war by showing considerable tactical and managerial brilliance. Sherman's war record through the late summer of 1864 was at the best spotty and mostly absolutely awful. Sherman was a complete failure as a general. Well, okay, as a fighting general, qualified. He performed poorly at first Bull Run, where his men fled in panic along with everybody else. In command in Kentucky, he had what appeared to be a full-scale nervous breakdown, claiming that an imaginary 200,000-man Confederate army was about to attack him, and behaving so strangely that newspapers across the country were soon calling him insane. At Shiloh, he failed completely to see 40,000 Confederates coming. He ordered a disastrous frontal assault at Vicksburg and performed so poorly at Missionary Ridge in Chattanooga that a contemporary historian just called him an outright failure. So much so that Grant had to lie to cover his performance up. I could go on with this list, but you get the idea. I mean, really, Sherman was not a battle fighter. He was, so as someone who knows Stonewall Jackson pretty well, that was a battle fighter. Sherman was the opposite. So how did this man I just described, become the William Tecumseh Sherman of legend, the man who marched to the sea? The short answer is that his brilliance, he was maybe the most brilliant person in all of the war, was not the same as Stonewall Jackson's. His contributions had more to do with his ability to think, oddly enough, and to transform those thoughts into a coherent theory of war. Let me give you a few examples. As military governor of Memphis, now this is not the last year of the war, this is prior to the last year of the war, as military governor of Memphis, constant rebel attacks convinced him that he was not fighting not just an army, but a population. His response: he rounded up citizens of Memphis and shipped them to prisons in the north. After one incident where guerrillas shot at Union ships in the Mississippi, he retaliated by burning an entire town to the ground. He didn't even bother to investigate who the perpetrators were. In 1863, he destroyed virtually everything of military or industrial value in Jackson, Mississippi, then he marched his army clear across the state, fanning his troops out behind him and cutting a wide swath of destruction. This is a long time before his march to the sea. His purpose, though, punish the guerrillas, make it impossible for them to live off the land. But more than that, his purpose was to hold all Southerners, especially civilians, responsible for their actions. He had another purpose too, and that was to show, he says, if you're going to secede from the government, he says, when you live under the federal government, I'm speaking as Sherman now, when you live under the federal government, you have the protections of the federal government, you have the rule of law, you have property rights, you can keep your money in banks and no one's going to take it from you. I said, I'm going to show you, Sherman, I'm going to show you Southerners what the jungle looks like, what it looks like when you don't have any protection. This was a completely radical idea. Nobody had this idea. Not even the most radical of the Republicans, the Lincoln's party, were spouting this kind of rhetoric. Sherman was the only one who thought this way. After taking the city of Atlanta in September of 1864, he shocked the nation again by ordering the expulsion of its citizens, all of them. All homeless, everybody in Atlanta rendered homeless. Atlanta's mayor complained that no such order had ever been given in American history. Quote, "What has this helpless people done," the mayor asked Sherman, "that they should be driven from their homes?" He was expressing what millions of Americans, North and South, were thinking. This seemed incredibly harsh, particularly in the North. They said, we aren't fighting people, we're not rendering people, we're not causing people to starve to death, we're fighting an army. It was thought dishonorable. Sherman, the only one talking this way. Sherman replied that by making war, the people of the South had forfeited all rights and expectations to be treated decently, and he wanted to show them what life was going to be like. He wrote, "The only way that the people of Atlanta can hope once again to live in peace and quiet is to stop the war, which can only be done by admitting that it began in error and is perpetuated in pride. We don't want your Negroes or your horses or your houses or your lands or anything you have, but we do want and will have just obedience to the laws of the United States. I want peace, and I believe it can only now be reached through union and war. But," this is the other side of Sherman, "but my dear sirs, when that peace comes, you may call on me for anything. Then I will share with you my last cracker and watch with you to shield your homes and families against danger." This was the two-sided Sherman. There was a war club in one hand, and there was a velvet glove in the other. If you want to stop doing what you're doing, and he offered this to the entire population of Georgia too. After the occupation of Atlanta, he said, if you want to stop fighting now, actually no, he offered it to Atlanta. Stop fighting now, and everything changes. And this was the way he talked. What he did next showed how completely he had changed the nature of war, of the war. With John Bell Hood, in order to take Atlanta, he had beaten a Confederate general named John Bell Hood. And Hood's army was fleeing from Atlanta now. Sherman has occupied Atlanta. Hood is fleeing up to the north and west, think of toward Chattanooga. And with the army fleeing, the logical move would have been for Sherman to follow him, right? You're going to follow the beaten army and, right, finish him off. And indeed, Sherman did for a relatively short distance. But he wasn't really making any progress, and Hood had his own sort of snipers out, and it was just going to be a lot of trouble to take the army. So Sherman's solution was he wired Washington that now that he thought about it, he really didn't care where Hood went or what happened to his army. The army, he argued, was irrelevant. You could hear the sound of 1,000 jaws dropping in Washington. The army is irrelevant. You're not going to. It was the only time that I know of where a Civil War commander had willingly disengaged from a beaten army. He said, I don't care. Nor did Sherman, having emptied out Atlanta, leave any garrison there. He was going to leave Atlanta, but he didn't. Normally, the Civil War is a game of real estate, right? You were going to take a city and hold it. If you were going to take Richmond, you would hold it, that was the plan. Or you would take and hold a city. He said, I don't care. I really don't care about holding the city. Doesn't make any difference to me. Now, think about it now. He has exiled all the population. He has refused to pursue Hood's army. And now he's saying, I'll leave a couple guys here. It doesn't matter to me. His war was not about that anymore. His war was about showing the South what the raw power of a huge Union army, unfettered and unopposed, marching freely through the South could do. Again, he was going to show them what the jungle looked like. He was going to hold the South collectively responsible for what had happened and for the secession and the war. The war, in Sherman's mind, was now about ideas, not about armies. And he proceeded in his march through Georgia, but most especially through South Carolina, to show how much sheer destruction could be wrought. I mean, he marched his army in a large 50-mile wide swath through Georgia, and he did plenty of damage, although it was nothing compared to what he did to South Carolina. When a Columbia, South Carolina resident asked him why he had burned the city down, he lectured her, I did not burn your town, nor did my army. Your brothers, sons, and husbands set fire to every city, town, and village in the land when they fired on Fort Sumter. That fire, kindled then and there by them, has been burning ever since and reached your houses last night. What made him so exceptional was less the scorched earth campaigns. When you think about it, I said he wasn't a very good soldier. He never fought very well, and he didn't really even like fighting. He didn't really like risking his own soldiers. So let's look at his march through Georgia to the sea, right, out to Charleston. And then he turns and he goes up through Columbia, South Carolina. That's not fighting. There's no fighting going on there. He's just fanning his troops out 50 miles and burning everything in that's what he's doing. He wasn't that kind of a general. But again, he made it was less the scorched earth than the ideas. And this is what also accompanied Sherman, was his absolutely unquenchable need to explain his actions all the time, which is what he did. And nobody in Washington was doing anything like this. So here was this guy, he had this hard moral truth that he was going to deliver to the South, and all he could do was, again, talk about it. You couldn't shut him up, and it was very clear what he thought, and he redefined the war completely. No one in the North had articulated anything like it. And of course, the North cheered him on, and the South hated him bitterly for it. Actually, if you want to win some money in a bar, one of the truths about William Tecumseh Sherman was that he, having failed at everything that he had done, and he really failed. He failed as a banker in San Francisco, and a banker in St. Louis, and a banker in New York, and his businesses, he didn't do well. And eventually the army didn't want him either. He thought, well, I'll go back into the army. This is just before the Civil War. The army didn't want him either, so he couldn't go into the army. So somehow somebody offered him a job from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as the head of, I think it was called the Louisiana State Seminary and Military Academy. Brand new school, sons of planters, they needed a president for it. Little school, brand new startup. And so Sherman comes south to Louisiana to take this job, which he's not very good at either. And he thinks the planter's sons are bratty and they pull pranks. And anyway, I shouldn't say he wasn't a total failure at it, but he had this job. And so then Louisiana secedes, which leaves Sherman in an interesting position. And one of the first things that happens when Louisiana secedes, and this was true of other southern states too, is the seceding state would go seize the federal arsenal, and would seize the guns and whatever, and so which is what they did. And they went to the federal arsenal and they seized the guns, and they needed some place to put all the stuff that they got, and that was Sherman's office at this school, which by the way has another name now. It's called LSU. So that's the money you win in a bar. Founding president of LSU, William Tecumseh Sherman, the most hated man in the South. And so he's writing his last dispatches, as the head of school, because he's going back north. He can't stay south, sitting on crates of Union guns that have been confiscated. Anyway, I always thought that was a great story. So anyway, Sherman was, if you look at the worst effect of the Lee paradox from a Southern point of view, I think most of them would agree that it was Sherman. My book is built around characters like Sherman, also people like Union battlefield nurse Clara Barton, who reinvented battlefield medicine and became one of the war's unlikeliest heroes. John Singleton Mosby, the war's greatest guerrilla fighter, as well as the usual suspects like Lee and Grant and Lincoln, and so on. And so my idea was to tell my idea when I write histories is always to tell whatever story I'm telling through a character, one way or the other. And there's so many stories to tell. And one of my favorite stories of all, and I'll close with this, involves 3 regiments of African-American soldiers who were part of the all-black Union 25th Corps, who had come into service right near the end of the war. Remember, there's 180,000 of these black troops suddenly in the Union Army. Okay, part of that was the Union 25th Corps. They were actually, if you look at them, we tend to think of, sometimes you think of black soldiers in the war as being a certain type of person, but this was a tremendously varied group of people. There were free blacks from New Jersey and Connecticut, tenant farmers from Maryland, slave camp refugees from Virginia, 4 winners of the Congressional Medal of Honor. They came in all hues. From people who look basically as white as I do to very black to anywhere in the middle. They were not one thing. They were many, many things. Anyway, in the early morning of April 3rd, 1865, they found themselves at the gates of Richmond. It's the great object of the war, right? Get to Richmond, the Confederate capital. In this case, this particular day, Richmond had just been abandoned by the rebel army. There were flames everywhere. Nothing stood between the Union 25th and the heart of Richmond, the burning Confederate capital. So the 25th Corps is marching up. They stop at an intersection a few miles from town to accept the city's surrender. And it was just one of the great moments of the war if you were a slave, because the slaves who came out to see them couldn't even conceive of a black person, and especially a former slave, in a uniform who was liberating Richmond. But this is what was going on. While the regiment and all this kind of fraternizing was going on, while the regimental band played Yankee Doodle and Battle Cry of Freedom. And black residents who had been slaves merely hours before, because this is, the abandonment of Richmond was the end of slavery in Richmond, now gathered around and danced and cheered and couldn't believe what they were looking at. Still, the city itself, the great capital on the hill by the James River, lay unconquered. And so a decision had to be made. Now, the Union troops, the black troops having stopped, a white Army Corps had marched up now. And a decision had to be made. Well, first of all, the soldiers knew exactly what was going to happen here, right? Somebody was going to be the first infantry in to the burning capital of, to the fallen capital of the rebels. Somebody was going to do that. And of course, a decision had to be made. Which is it going to be, the white soldiers or the black soldiers? And guess what the decision was? It was not the black soldiers. And so off the white soldiers went, dreaming of glory, dreaming of the stories that they were going to tell their grandchildren. But as it turns out, the black soldiers had no intention of giving up that easily. While the white brigade proceeded joyously down the main road, there was only one road. I could describe well, you'd have to know Richmond. But anyway, they're going down the road. They're going to be the first infantry into Richmond. The African-American troops take off overland. They're hopping fences and going through people's backyards, and they're making their way. And they're so motivated that they get there about 15 minutes before the white troops do. And thus, they were the first infantry to officially enter the city. This, of course, didn't go over very well with the White Brigade, who came in behind them. And there was a campaign mounted almost immediately to disprove that the black soldiers had been the first ones in. But the evidence suggested otherwise, and it has certainly come down in history that it was otherwise. But some of that evidence came from a very resourceful black newspaper correspondent named Thomas Morris Chester, who worked for a Philadelphia newspaper, the only black correspondent for a northern newspaper covering it, but he had gotten himself down there. He had positioned himself so that he could actually see who the first troops into the city were. And he wrote, there may be others who claim the distinction of being the first to enter the city, he wrote in his dispatch, but as I was ahead of every part of the force but the cavalry, I can affirm that the black regiments were the first infantry to enter the city limits. This was a lot of glory and a lot of irony happening at the same time. But there's more to the story. When Chester filed that dispatch to his paper in Philadelphia, he happened to be sitting in the speaker's chair in the Confederate House of Representatives on the top of the hill in Richmond, the very engine room of the Confederacy. Now, Morris was not a shy man. As he sat there in the speaker chair, calmly writing his account of the first infantry to enter Richmond, a recently surrendered and paroled Confederate officer kind of stomped up to him, flew into a rage, and said, "This is an abomination. You can't do this." A black man sitting in the chair of the Speaker of the Confederate House. This was sacrilege. He demanded that Chester leave the hall. Chester barely looked up and continued writing. The officer then rushed him. Chester stood up. Chester was a pretty big guy, could take care of himself, delivered a roundhouse punch that sent the man reeling. Then Chester returned to his desk, continued calmly writing. The rebel officer, now seething with anger, then appealed to his fellow Union officers for his sword. He wanted to thrash Chester, so "Please, sir, may I have your sword so that I may thrash this man?" And the Union soldiers declined to give him their sword, but instead they offered to clear an area in the Confederate House where Chester and the officer could have a fist fight. The rebel officer declined. Chester later wrote about this event, which, had it happened the day before, would have resulted in his execution. He explained it by saying simply, and I quote, "I thought I would exercise my rights as a belligerent." Anyway, that's it. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. I would be happy to take questions. We've got some time for questions, and happy to entertain whatever you'd like to talk about on this book or other books, or anything you want to talk about.
I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
So how do you explain Sherman's support from Lincoln, Grant, and others, given his relative incompetence on the battlefield? It's surprising they supported the idea guy.
Right. Okay. So the question is, how do we explain the support Sherman had from Lincoln and Grant, considering how incompetent he was on the battlefield. The answer is, and this is really kind of extraordinary, it's all Grant. Grant protected him. Lincoln didn't know. I mean, Grant's battle reports from Chattanooga completely rewrote the battle to protect Sherman. And the funny thing about Grant is, I mean, Grant, I think Grant's just one of the most remarkable men I've ever encountered, certainly in American history and world history. The thing about Grant was he protected him all the way. At Vicksburg, too, Vicksburg was a bad performance. Again, if you read Grant's battle reports, they don't reflect that. They could have just unloaded on him. They didn't. And Sherman's anyway, this was sort of the mode. And Grant always believed in Sherman. He believed in Sherman throughout all this time. I mean, Sherman everybody thought he was insane. Like, insane was the word they used in the American press after what he had done in the Midwest. He was a failure. He was thought to be mentally unstable. He was a bad battle manager. He was actually great at the organizational aspects and administrative aspects of an army, but he was very bad at battle fighting. And so Grant protects him. And the interesting thing is that Grant always believed in Sherman. And I think I didn't really think about this until you asked it, but I think Lincoln was just filtered out of that, because Grant, at some point, Lincoln believes in Grant, and that's the summer of 1864, and that's it. There's going to be no change in that. And the thing about him is, and Grant was right. Sherman was a genius. Sherman was brilliant. Sherman was one of the most transformative characters in American history, whether you like him or hate him. He was those things. He was everything, and I shouldn't say everything that Grant thought he was. I don't know what Grant really thought about him. But he was Grant's creature all the way. And when you think about when he abandons his following Hood's army, that's insane. I mean, the War Department would have, in the year 2 of the war, year 3 of it, would have crushed that. Wouldn't have happened. Not garrisoning Atlanta would have crushed it. It wouldn't have happened. So you have, anyway, my answer, it's a really good question. And the answer is Grant. Yes, sir.
I would disagree with what you say totally about Sherman, because he did go down and take Atlanta. He beat 2 generals, including our own General Hood, easily, and he didn't take it. Those weren't failures.
Okay, so the question was, he's saying he disagrees with me and his about Sherman is his example is Atlanta. One of the problems with what happens, what Atlanta is really, it starts out really. The campaign that ends in Atlanta starts out in Chattanooga, or just south in Tennessee, and so here you have Sherman fighting, Johnston, and you have Sherman who outnumbers Johnston 2-1, and he tactically loses one major battle when he's going down, which is typical of Sherman. But you have this kind of flanking. Johnston retreats. The vastly outnumbered by Sherman. Johnston retreats, and finally they replace Johnston with Hood, and then Hood attacks. I think I certainly agree that Sherman's last move, the final move that beats Hood, was inspired, and he absolutely left the lines where everybody expected him to be, and he went somewhere else. That would be probably the exception to the rule. Although I don't think you could say that his campaign coming south from Tennessee into Georgia was anything brilliant, and I don't think anybody considers it as a brilliant campaign. In any case, he didn't really win by fighting so much. I mean, there wasn't, the casualties at Atlanta were minimal. It was more maneuver than anything else. But I agree with that point. I think that would be the one sort of final move where he abandons his lines and he abandons his normal lines and moves south in Atlanta. Yeah.
You think that Sherman had maybe I don't know how to say it,
and a mule.
land. And do you think if they would have kept that in, that it would have changed the history of blacks in the United States as in their civil rights and stuff like that? Do you think that would have changed it? They would have kept that also?
If you mean if they had been able to keep the land that he gave them in the Carolinas,
Yeah.
or
and
wherever that
also,
was,
did he
Georgia.
have- Did he kind of have a heart for them? It seems like
He did. It was strange. He had. If you look at the way Sherman talks about black people, it sounds very racist. He uses the N-word liberally, and people weren't doing that then. And in fact, there was a time when Lincoln was so concerned about Sherman's language about blacks that he sent Stanton, I believe it was Stanton, was sent down there to see what was going on and tell him to shut up. And one of the things that happened, this is really interesting, one of the things that happened was that, it wasn't Seward, it was Stanton. Anyway, so he gets down there and he's interviewing Sherman, and at some point he wants Sherman to leave the room, and he wants to talk to he's got these black ministers and community leaders, and he wants to talk to them personally about Sherman. And he tells Sherman to leave the room. There's this really weird moment, and brings the black leaders in, expecting to hear that this guy's just the worst, this guy is, yeah, he's won some battles or whatever he is, but he's really very difficult, and we find him very difficult. They told Stan he was the greatest guy they'd ever met. They just across the board, they thought he treated them with respect. And so it was funny, because if you listen to his language, it doesn't sound this way, but they themselves thought he treated them with more respect than anybody did. And Stan just went away with his head spinning, went back to Washington and said they love it. And it was weird. So, but to your question though, could he have done something? Could he have actually, yes, he did give that land taken from planters, gave it to slaves, former slaves. Could that have gone anywhere? I don't think so. I mean, that just got sucked up into the general policies of the War Department in Washington, and it didn't last ultimately, and I don't think it could have lasted. Just because Sherman wasn't in a position legislatively, he wasn't an executive officer. He was a general.
I have a question.
Yes.
My wife and I studied the Civil War a little bit. My question is about President Grant. Historians historically rate him lower in the ranking. Our readings kind of tell us that he was a much better president than he's given credit for. I kind of agree with that. Do you agree with that? What's your assessment?
Yes. So I should say, first of all, that I haven't studied Grant as president. My work has been in the Civil War, his life up to the Civil War and through the end of the Civil War. So I just qualify myself as a scholar on that subject. Okay, now as a consumer of books and articles about Grant, I completely agree with you. And I think that the revisionism that has gone on with Grant over the last 20 years is correct. Grant, yes, he was a far better president. He was a far better everything. I mean, and if you read my book, you get a view of his drinking. His drinking is, even in the Chernow biography, you get you would think the guy was just a drunk. That's absolutely not true. And anyway, yeah, I'm a big fan of Grant. And as a consumer, the same thing you are. I conclude the same way, that he had his problems. There's no question about that. And one of his problems, he had the corruption that went on under his administration was just terrible. And the question is, to what do we attribute that? Anyway.
Thank you.
Sorry, I wish I could be more authoritative on it. But yeah. Yes.
As an author, what sort of time frame do you set for yourself for research in order to publish the book? And in the future, what interests are you looking at for your future books?
Okay, the question is, what sort of, approach do I use to my books in writing them, and how long does it take to write them, and then what is the future for me, I guess, in book writing? These books that, typically my books take me about 3 years. And you'd have to say that 2 years of that is research. So people, ask me to say, well, do you write every day? And I say, it's like when research to writing is 60-40, you're not writing every day. In fact, I go through these long periods of time when I just wonder, I wonder about myself. I don't seem to be a writer anymore. I don't seem to write anything anymore. What are you doing? You writing? No, I'm not writing anything. I'm doing research. But in my business, you can't write it if you haven't researched it. And so I think typically 2 years to research it, 1 year to write it. And with me, that goes pretty much sequentially. I mean, I can't. I need to do a lot of research before I start writing. That's not really true. I do mix it up, but I don't. But there has to be so for example, the Stonewall Jackson book, the first book I wrote about the Civil War, which I didn't. If I knew what I was getting into, I never would have done that. The Civil War is a harsh mistress. There is so much reading you have to do just to start thinking about what you're doing. You have to know the secondary sources, and you have to know what everybody's ever done. And thank God I didn't write about Grant, because there's been 680 books written about Grant, 680 that I know of. And so it's, but it is, I mean, research is kind of the name of the game with what I do. So the new book is, so I ran into, so I was reading a history of the British Empire, a really great history by a writer named James Morris called a Pax Britannica trilogy. Anybody here ever read that? It's kind of not, it's really, It's not read anymore. Anyway, it's the third, it's a wonderful history of the British Empire. Anyway, the third installment, called Farewell the Trumpets, had 3 pages on, and that was the third installment was the one with Churchill and, the kind of the end of the empire as things go down. And it had a 2-page section on this airship called R-101 that was, so we all know the Hindenburg, right? Hindenburg went down in 1937 in flames in Lakehurst, New Jersey, and the airship I was reading about was 7 years before that. A much more interesting story, much bigger boom, more people dead, but especially a more interesting story. The Hindenburgs and all that interesting story. And so I just ran into this and I thought, I'll do it. I read, and also nobody had ever really written it. No writers, no historians of any worth had ever written about it. There've been a few books here and there, but really nothing to worry about. And the interesting thing on that, so I got that book contract in March of 2020. And one of the things that I have to do is go to, if I'm writing about 1930, I have to, this is really the early part of the 20th century, what I have to do is I have to go to libraries and collections and archives and museums, and that's where my material's going to be, right? Letters and diaries and stuff, whatever, federal government records and things like that. So think March 2020. Okay, the entire world was closed to me immediately. Not a single library, not a single archive, not a single collection, not a single museum. I needed them in France, Germany, England, and the United States. Not a single one. No. There you go. And I just finished the book. So I developed a lot of workarounds, let's put it that way. And then this year, I actually almost spent almost a month in England this year, finally. But it was a tough few years when everything was closed and you couldn't travel. But that one too will be about a 3-year project from start to finish, I guess. My COVID book. Anyway, yes.
What's the next book you're thinking about writing, like in the future?
This is it right now. I normally have ideas stacked up, like Planes at LaGuardia, ideas waiting to be considered or waiting to be done. But I don't really have one. So if you have an idea, I honestly normally do. I normally do have ideas. There are ideas, but I'm not interested in them. And there were things that happened, like people say, well, why don't you just write more about Native America? And one of the problems with the success that I had with Empire of the Summer Moon is it unleashed a wave of all these books that I could have written. about the Sioux. My friend Alan or Tom Clavin did the Sioux, and I went from people thinking there was no market for that kind of thing to people thinking there was this great market for that kind of thing. And so it took away some of, I wouldn't mind returning to Native Americans history, but a lot of it got taken because of my own book success. So, trouble. Why the title Hymns of the Republic? It plays off of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was, which is famous, mine eyes have seen the glory, that Battle Hymn of the Republic. And I wanted to, I guess, suggest the diversity of experience in the war, that there wasn't just one. There were many hymns, as there were. There was even a Black Battle of the Republic song. It was known as the Black Battle of the Republic. But just, other ways of looking at it. And indeed, my book just, it examines the war from many different points of view. Anyway, that was the idea. I'm not sure it worked all that well. I probably should have named it something, like Blood and Guts and something like that.
Thank you, Sam. That was wonderful. We appreciate that. Now, that's buy some books, sign some books. There's some goodies, wine and cheese and stuff. So, and you can, like I said a while ago, you can do that in here and sit. And then my friend Tom Hamilton is going to determine what group you're in. Tom has a lot of power that he's going to wield. So, okay, thank you all very much.